Masechet Sanhedrin Daf Yod Tet. The Mishnah listed several laws pertaining to a Kohen Gadol, and it said Choletz v'Cholsin. A Kohen Gadol can do Chalitza if his brother dies without children, and if he dies without children, his brother can do Chalitza for his widow. And also regarding Yibum, if the Kohen Gadol dies without children, his brother can do Yibum on the Kohen Gadol's widow. However, the Kohen Gadol cannot do Yibum. If the Kohen Gadol's brother dies without children, a Kohen Gadol cannot perform Yibum. The reason is twofold. Number one, he's not allowed to marry a widow, and she is a widow, so that would be violating a lo ta'aseh. Second, he can only marry a betula. That's a mitzvah ta'aseh. And if his brother was married, then we presume that his wife is not a betula. And so that's the reason for that. The Gemara asks about the Mishnah. Kapasik v'taneh lo shena min ha'erusin v'la shena min ha'nisuin. Notice how the Mishnah just gives a rule that a Kohen Gadol cannot do Yibum, and it makes no distinction between whether his brother only had Kiddushin with his wife before he died, or whether he had full Nisuin with his wife before he died. So it seems like in both cases, the Kohen Gadol cannot do Yibum. Now let's analyze each. Bishlama mina Nisuin have aseh v'lo ta'aseh. Ven aseh doche lo ta'aseh va'aseh. If his brother was fully married, then this law makes sense, because for the Kohen Gadol to do Yibum, he would be violating a Misvat Aseh. Misvat Aseh says that you have to marry a Betula, and his wife is not a Betula, the widow is not a Betula. And furthermore, a Lo Taseh, Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry a widow, and his sister-in-law is a widow. So he would be violating an Aseh and a Lo Taseh, and you cannot push off an aseh and a lo ta'aseh because of one aseh. The mitzvah of Yibum, take your brother's widow, that's a mitzvah aseh. So on the one hand, we have a mitzvah aseh to do Yibum. On the other hand, we have an aseh and a lo ta'aseh to marry a betula and not to marry an almanah. And so therefore, we understand perfectly well why the Kohen Gadol cannot do Yibum for his brother who was fully married to his wife before he died. However, if his brother just did Kiddushin, but not Nisuin, so that means they never had Bi'ah. We're assuming they did Kiddushin with money or with a shtar. And therefore, she is still a widow. That's true. So there is a lo ta'aseh for the Kohen Gadol to marry her, because even though there was no Nisuin but only Kiddushin, that is still called an almanah. So there's a mitzvah lo ta'aseh that the Kohen Gadol would violate. There's no violation of the aseh betula, because she is still a betula. And so in this case, you have a aseh, and generally a mitzvah aseh that would be doing performing Yibum would override the one single lo ta'aseh of not marrying an almanah. And so now we're wondering, why did the Mishnah say that the Kohen Gadol cannot do Yibum across the board? Really, he should be able to do Yibum if his brother only had Kiddushin. And the answer is Gezerah, Bi'ah Rishona atu Bi'ah Sheniyah. Really, you're right, Mideoraita, he should be able to. But the rabbis make a Gezerah that from the first time that this Kohen Gadol had Bi'ah to perform Yibum, to the second time they have bi'ah. In other words, the first time that they have bi'ah, that is a mitzvah of Yibum. Okay, fantastic. You accomplished, you fulfilled this important mitzvah of Yibum by taking your brother's widow. And that's a mitzvah aseh, and that overrides the lo ta'aseh of almanah. Chazak u'baruch, you did that mitzvah. However, if he should remain married to her and have a second bi'ah, there's no mitzvah in the second bi'ah. Really, he can have bi'ah once with her, and then he has to divorce her. He can no longer be with her. We are afraid, however, once we allow him to do Yibum and have bi'ah with her once, then he might remain married to her and have bi'ah with her again. But the second time he has bi'ah will be only a violation of taking an almanah and no mitzvah. And therefore we say, you know what? Don't even start down that road. road, don't even do Yibum in the first place. Tanyana mehachi, im kadmu uba'alu bi'arishona kanu, v'asu l'kayiman bebi'ah sheniya. There's a braita that supports this answer. The braita teaches that if the Kohen Gadol went ahead and he had bi'ah with his brother's widow, the first bi'ah, then kanu, they are married. That is a valid yibum. So even though we said before he shouldn't do it, but if he went and did it without asking anybody, he just went and did bi'ah, it is a valid yibum, and they are married. However, he is not allowed to remain with her and have relations a second time, because only the first time would be a mitzvah aseh that can override the lo ta'aseh, but the second time there is no mitzvah. Met lo met. The Mishnah goes on and says, if a Kohen Gadol loses a loved one, then he is not allowed to go with the funeral procession because we don't want him to become tameh, and we're afraid he's going to see his relative who died, and he's going to want to carry or touch the corpse, and then he'll become tameh. He's not allowed, and therefore he's not allowed to attend the funeral. However, he can stay on the side streets. He can come afterwards and be out of sight. Tenora Banan, a baraita that elaborates on what the Mishnah said. Umina mikdash lo yeseh mahen, aval yosehu acharehen, kesad, hen nichsin vehu nigle, hen niglin vehu nichse. Baraita quotes a pasuk that the Kohen Gadol cannot leave the sanctuary. If someone dies, he can't go out to the cemetery, he can't leave the sanctuary. What does that mean, lo yeseh? It means he can't go out with them with the funeral procession. However, he can go behind them. How so? When they are hidden from view, then he reveals himself. And when they reveal himself, he is hidden from view. In other words, you have the funeral procession is on a certain street. He has to be hidden. He has to go only on the side street. But then when they're hidden from view, when they leave that street, they turn a corner, then he can come on that street. So he has to always be a block behind on the side street out of view wherever they are, which is what the Mishnah said. And even that, going behind the funeral procession, that's only allowed within the city. But he can only get to the Kohen Gadol, can only go to the entrance of the city gates. And then when the funeral procession leaves the city gates and goes out to the cemetery, he cannot go with them. He has to stay behind. That was the opinion of Rabbi Meir in the Mishnah. However, in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda disagreed. We can look at the Mishnah here, right? Rabbi Yehuda omer, eno yoseh min hamikdash, mishum shenemar min hamikdash lo yeseh. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. This is no. He can't go on the side streets and go up until the entrance of the city. He cannot go anywhere at all. He has to stay in the Bet HaMikdash and continue doing his service, as the pasuk says, Umin HaMikdash lo yeseh. So he's reading that pasuk literally. So now the Gemara asks, Shapir Kama Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda seems to have a good point. The pasuk, read it literally, it says he can't leave the Bet HaMikdash. So how is Rabbi Meir going to explain this pasuk if it says he can't leave the Bet HaMikdash? Amar lach Rabbi Meir achi lebeto namilo. Rabbi Meir says if you're going to read this pasuk totally literally, then that would mean he can't even go home. He has to stay in the Bet HaMikdash, he has to stay there day and night, sleep there, and he can't even go home. But obviously that's not true. He can go home. Rather, when the pasuk says he cannot come down, he cannot leave sanctity, it doesn't mean the Bet HaMikdash. It means from his position of sanctity. So now if he has to be tahor. If he would touch something tameh, then he would no longer have his level of sanctity. He wouldn't be able to serve in the Bet HaMikdash. So he has to keep his high level of sanctity and be tahor. Now, therefore, as long as he stays on the side streets, so there'll be an indicator that he's not part of the funeral procession, right? He knows the law. You can't be on the same street as the funeral procession. You have to be out of sight. So because there is that indicator, that will always be a reminder to him, and he will not touch the coffin. And so there's no problem. Obviously, he can go out of the Bet HaMikdash, he can go home, he can go wherever he wants. He just can't go near the funeral procession, so that he won't become tameh. And he can't leave his kiddusha, not Bet HaMikdash. Rabbi Yehuda, how will he answer that? Rabbi Yehuda says, no, it's not sufficient as an indicator that he just be in hiding on the side, because he's so bitter and so sad. If you let the Kohen Gadol out of the Bet HaMikdash and he goes and is behind the funeral procession, even if he's a block out of the way, but at some point he's going to see whatever his father, his sister, and he's going to be so overwhelmed with sadness that he's going to run up, forget about his status as Kohen Gadol, and want to touch the corpse and become tameh. And so we can't. He might be overcome by his feelings, and therefore we should not let him come near the funeral procession at all, but rather literally stay in the Bet HaMikdash. Keshehu Menachem, the Mishnah taught that when the Kohen Gadol goes to visit an Avel to give him comfort, then the attendant of the Kohen Gadol stands between the Kohen Gadol and the other people. Tenor Banan, a braita that elaborates on who stands where. Keshehu Ober Beshura Lenachem et Havelim, Segan Umashuach She'avar Bimino, Verosh Bet Av Avelim V'chol Ha'am Misemolo. When the Kohen Gadol goes to visit mourners, the mourners would stand in a line. That was the general custom. They would all stand in a line, and the other people would go down the line and offer them words of comfort. So when the Kohen Gadol is doing that, then he will have the Segan, so that's the assistant to the Kohen Gadol, and Meshuach, the one who is anointed. That means if a Kohen Gadol is out of commission, he gets a blemish or is tameh, then he gets an attendant and a sub to take his place, and that sub will take his place and be Kohen Gadol for a while until the original Kohen Gadol gets better and comes back. That person who was formerly Kohen Gadol, we don't demote him down to be just a regular Kohen, because Ma'alin Bakodesh ve'en moridin. And so from then on, he's called the Mashuach, the one who had been anointed as Kohen Gadol, even though right now he is not serving. So the Segan and the Mashuach, they will stand on the right side of the Kohen Gadol, and the head of the Bet Av, the head of the family that is in charge of the service in the Bet HaMikdash, of the Ma'amad that week, and the mourners and all the rest of the nation will be on the left side of the Kohen Gadol. If the Kohen Gadol himself lost a loved one, and he's standing in the line and others are coming to bring him comfort, then Segan Mimino, so he will have the deputy on his right. And notice it doesn't say anything about the Mashuach being there. Verosh Beta v'chol ha'am misemolo, and the head of that of the family that's in charge that week, and the rest of the people are on his left. So the Gemara comments, Aval Mashuach shavar la ate gabeh. However, the Kohen who was anointed from the past, he was once Kohen Gadol, he was like the vice Kohen Gadol. He is not present when the Kohen Gadol is in Avel and other people are coming to comfort him. Why isn't he there? Because the Kohen Gadol will feel depressed and upset if the Mashuach is there. Savar ka chadi bi. He'll say, "Oh, he's happy about me." Right? That's the tension between, let's say, a president and a vice president. If the president gets a heart attack, the vice president, he might say, "Oh, that's terrible," but really inside he's like, "Oh, maybe now's my chance that I can be president." And so they were always afraid that the president, might look at the vice president. "Oh, you're happy? I got a heart attack. Why are you coming to visit me over here in the hospital?" And so when the Kohen Gadol is in mourning and then the Mashuach is there, we suspect that the Mashuach might feel a little happy about this bad thing that happened to the Kohen Gadol. And so the Kohen Gadol is going to feel depressed if the Mashiach Mashuach L'She'avad would come and visit him, and therefore Mashuach L'She'avad should not go and visit him. Amara Papa Shema Mina Meha Matnita Telat. Shema Mina Hainu Segan Hainu Memune. The Papa says we can learn three things from this Baraita. Number one, that Segan and Memune are the same thing, because here in the Baraita it says Segan, and in the Mishnah it says Memune. So the appointed person or the deputy, that's the same thing. And second, we learned that the the mourners should stand in one place, and all the people that are coming to comfort, they pass by each one. So they move while the Avelim stand still. And we also learn that the mourners stand to the left side of those who are giving comfort, because we see that's the Kohen Gadol, when he comes to give people comfort, the mourners are on his left. And so we see that they're always going to be on the left side. Now, Braita elaborates on this. The original custom was that the mourners stand in one place, and the people who come to give comfort, they pass by. They'll form a line, and they'll pass by and speak to each person. However, one time, there were two families in Jerusalem that were fighting with each other. Zot omeret ani oberet techila, vezot omeret ani oberet techila, and they found an appropriate place to fight about each family's own honor. And one of the families said, "I should go. I'm more important than you. I should go and comfort this family first." And the other one said, "No, I'm more important than you. I should be ahead of you in going to give comfort to the mourners." And so they were just fighting in the middle of the place of mourning, which I'm sure was not very helpful or comforting to the family. So then they made a new takana. You know what? Let's flip it around. Instead of the mourners staying in one place and then the people coming and passing them by, because then the people are going to fight, so we'll do the other way around. That will have all the people that want to give comfort, they stay in the line and stand still, and the mourners will then go and move from one to the next. And that way the mourners will choose if they're going to go this way or that way, and that will avoid fighting. Amar Rami bar Abba, hechezir bi Yosef hadavar liyoshno besipori sheyehu abelim omdim v'chol ha'am oberin. Later on, Bi Yosef reverted the custom back to the original one when he was in Sipori, and he had the mourners stay in one place and the people would then move, which sounds like it's more appropriate that the people that are coming should be the ones moving, and the Avelim who are receiving the guests should stay in one place. Now that we mentioned one thing that Rami bar Abba said regarding Rabbi Yosef making an enactment. So here's another one. He made an enactment in Sipori that a woman, when she is walking in the marketplace, she should not have her child behind her because of the incident that happened. The incident that happened is so terrible, Kamanat doesn't even want to say it. But it was a kidnapping incident. And since the child was behind her, someone went and kidnapped the child. The mother went to look for the child and then went to some place. And then when she went there, the mother was assaulted, and therefore the rabbi said, listen, from now on, keep your children in front of you where you can see them. And another enactment that Rabbi Yosef made in Sipori is that if women go to the outhouse, then they should be talking to each other, so that if there's a man who also is going to go to the outhouse, if they're not talking, he'll think that there's nobody in it, and then he'll enter into the bathroom, and then they'll violate yichud. They'll be all together in seclusion, which is not good. And therefore, he made an enactment that if there are two women that are in the bathroom, they should talk to each other, just have conversation loud, and that way, if there's any man that's walking by and wants to go in, he'll hear the woman talking, and that way he will wait until they finish. Amar Rav Menashe bar Ut she'ilit et Rabbi Yoshia Rabba bebet almin dehusal v'amar li en shura pechuta me'asara bnei adam ve'en abelim min haminyan. Rav Menashe, the son of Ut, said, I asked the following question of Rabbi Yoshia the Great in the cemetery of Hutzal. I guess that was an appropriate place. That's where this question came up. Usually at the cemetery is where the Avelim would line up right after the burial. They would line up in front of the cemetery, and people would give them comfort. And so that's where he asked about this. And he was told that when you make a shura, when you make a line to give comfort to the mourners, it should not be less than 10 people. And the mourners themselves don't count. towards the 10, but rather there should be a minyan of people coming to give comfort to the mourners. A minyan represents the community, and so it should be at least a whole community that comes and gives comfort. And this is probably the source for today bringing a minyan and having prayers in a Bet Avel, right? That a minyan should come and be there to bring comfort, and they represent the entire community. Ben shavelim omdim v'chol ha'am oberin, ben shavelim ovrin v'chol ha'am omedin. And it makes no difference in this regard whether the avelim are standing still and the people are walking by, or whether the avelim are walking and the people are standing still. The people visiting should be at least a minyan. Keshehu mitnachem. Now, quoting the Mishnah again, let's go back and look at the Mishnah. When the Kohen Gadol is receiving consolation from others, then the people will come to him and say, Anachnu kaparatecha, we are your atonement, and he will answer them, you should be blessed from heaven. So let's elaborate on that. Ibaya lehu, ki menachem hu acharine, hechi amar lehu. When the Kohen Gadol is giving comfort to others, what does he tell them? Tashema the Kohen Gadol will tell them, you should find consolation. We now elaborate on this answer. What exactly is the case? Do you mean that when other people are coming to comfort him, then he should tell them, find consolation? That doesn't make sense. Because then he's actually cursing them. The Kohen Gadol lost a loved one. People are coming to visit him, right? And they say, we are your atonement. And then if he says back to them, you should find consolation, that's actually a curse, because he's telling them, oh, you should lose a loved one, and then you will need consolation. So it doesn't make sense that he's saying this in response to them. Rather, the question and the answer was about a case where the Kohen Gadol is going to visit someone else who is mourning. And so what should he say when he goes to visit those mourners? You should find consolation, because they are mourners. So that's the appropriate thing to say. Melech lo dan. Now the Mishnah said that a king cannot be a judge, nor is he judged. He cannot testify, nor do people testify against him. Amar Rav Yosef, lo shanu ela malchei Yisrael, aval malchei Bet David dan vedanin otan. Rav Yosef says this law of the Mishnah applies only to the kings of Israel, to the north, because they did not follow Torah very well and were not very obedient to it. However, the kings of the south, from the Davidic dynasty, they can be judges and they can be judged. Tichtiv Bet David ko amar Adonai dinu laboker mishpat, as the pasuk says in Yirmiyah, house of David, go execute justice in the morning, meaning that the kings would be judges. So that's number one, they can be judges. And if they cannot be judged, how can they judge? We have a rule that it's reciprocal. Kashet asmecha ve'achar kach kashet acherim. A pasuk we saw from Sefanya. Gather yourselves and gather together. Resh Lakish made a derasha over here, not as gather together, but to adorn yourself. First adorn yourself, and then adorn others. In other words, if you're going to before you can go and be a judge against others, first be judged yourself. Make sure you are innocent, and only then can you be a judge of others. And therefore, if the kings of the house of David can be judges, then certainly they also can be judged. So really, this is the ideal law: is that a king is not above the law; he is subject to the law himself. That's the whole point of the laws of kings in Sefer Devarim. And so yes, he can be judged and he can judge. However, from the kings of the north, the reason why they cannot be judged is because of the following incident. Ela Malchei Yisrael mai ta'ama lo. How come the kings of the north cannot be judged? Mishum ma'aseh shehaya, because of the story. De'amdeh Yannai malka ketal nafsha. Because a servant of King Yannai killed a person. King Yannai was one of the Hasmonean kings, a very evil one. And here is a family tree. We have Matityahu, the head of the family, and then Yehuda Maccabi, known for his heroism. He's the most famous. And then after he died, his brother Yonatan took over and became Kohen Gadol, and then his brother Shimon. After that, it went to Shimon's son, Yochanan Hyrcanus, who also was Kohen Gadol, and after that to his son, Aristobulus, who was the first to call himself not only Kohen Gadol, but also king. But Aristobulus died after 1 year. He was married to Shlom Sion. When he died, Alexander Yannai, another son of John Hyrcanus, did Yibum and married Shlom Sion Hamalka. And Alexander Yannai, then he was the Kohen and the king, which was also very controversial because you're not supposed to be a Kohen Gadol and a king. Anyway, that's why he's called here Yannai Malka, the king. His servant committed murder. Amar lehu Shimon ben Shatach lachachamim tunu anechem bo undunenu. So Shimon ben Shatach, who was a great sage and also happened to be the brother of Shlom Sion. She, by the way, was righteous. After Alexander Yannai died, Shlom Sion became the queen, the regnant queen, and she is known for good. So Shimon ben Shatach told the sages, "Go and put your eyes on him and let us judge him." In other words, go, get him, summons him to court, and he has to be judged. Shalachu le'abdecha ketal nafsha. So they did. They sent a message to King Yannai and said that your slave killed a person. You got to send him to court. Shedare lehu. So King Yannai sent his servant to court. Shalachu le ta'ant nameh and so now the judges said to King Yannai, you have to come too, because the Torah says if someone's ox kills a person, then he should be testified against with his owner. The Torah says that the owner of the ox has to come and stand over his ox, and the same thing here with the servant that you own, and your servant committed murder. You have to come and hear the testimony and stand by your slave while the slave is being judged. You're in a way also being judged. Atavi atib. So King Yannai, listen, he came and he sat down in the courtroom. Amar le Shimon ben Shatach, Yannai amelech, amod al raglecha ve'yidu becha, ve'lo lefanenu ata omed, ele lifnei mi she'amar v'haya olam ata omed, she'nemar ve'amedu shenei ha'anashim asher lahem hariv ve'gomer. And so then Shimon ben Shatach, who's in charge of the court, he says, King Yannai, stand up and let the witnesses testify against you. That was the court procedure, that when the witnesses are testifying against someone, that person stands up. And he said, you should know, you are not standing just in front of us. You are standing before he who spoke and the world was created. You're standing before Hashem, as the Pasuk says, that the two people who have a litigation will stand, and the rest of the Pasuk says, Lifnei Hashem. And so, this is a very serious thing. Maybe make sure to take this court procedure seriously. And so this was a standard way that the judge would talk to the defendant and the litigants. Amar lo keshe tomar ata ela kema shimrucha berecha. And King Yannai refused to stand up. He says, I'm not going to stand just because you said so, but I will stand, but depending on what your colleagues say. I'll listen to what the whole court says. I'm not going to listen only to you. Nifna lemino kabshu penehem bakarka. Nifna Shimon ben Shatach turned to his right. He sees all the judges put their faces in the ground. He turns to the left, and all the judges on his left put their faces in the ground. In other words, they were scared of King Yannai to go and say, oh, King Yannai, you have to stand up. It's demeaning to King Yannai, and he would take retribution against them. So they all looked down, like the thinker. They put their heads down, looking at the floor as if they're deep in thought about something. They're making believe they didn't hear. Amar lehen Shimon ben Shatach, ba'alei machshavot atem. Shimon ben Shatach says, oh, I see you guys are deep in thought. Yavo ba'al machshavot yipara mikem. May the master of thoughts, meaning Hashem, come and punish you for not following the proper court procedure. You're being scared of the king, but you're the judges, and he's being judged, and so you have to follow the right procedure, and you can't just be afraid like that and bury your heads in the ground. Miyad ba Gavriel v'chabatan bakarka v'metu. Gavriel, the angel, immediately came came and struck them down to the ground, and they died. Right at that moment, they made a decree and said, a king cannot be a judge and is not judged. He does not testify, and others do not testify against a king. And the reason is simply practical. A king has too much power, and he will, and he can't get a fair judgment. The judges will all be scared to put him on trial, since he can't be judged. He can't judge either, and no one can testify against him. But this is an unfortunate result of this terrible story. But really, ideally, a king is like that of the Davidic dynasty, who can judge and be judged. Lo choles velo cholsin bechule. We move to the next part of the Mishnah that says regarding a king. A king does not do chalitza. It is demeaning to him, because part of chalitza, if his brother dies without children, is that the widow will spit towards him. So that's the meaning. So he does not do chalitza. If his wife dies, chalitza is not done for her. He does not do yibum, nor is yibum done for his widow should he die without children. However, the Yehuda in the Mishnah says, if a king wants to do chalitza or yibum, he can forego his honor and he can do chalitza. Ini, we have a challenge. V'amar Rab Asher, afilu leman damar nasi shemachal al kevodo kevodo machul, melech shemachal al kevodo and kevodo machul, shneimar som tasim alecha melech shetehe emato alecha. Rav Asher said, even according to the opinion that says a nasi, a prince of a tribe, who forgoes his honor, he can do that if he wants to forgo his honor. However, even that opinion would agree that a king who forgoes his honor does not work. Even if a king said it's okay, you can do this, still he's not allowed. We cannot allow him to forgo his honor, because the pasuk says, place upon yourself a king. That means that his fear should be upon the people. It's very important that people fear a king, and therefore, even it's not up to him. The whole fear of the state is dependent on fear of the king, and so therefore, this is a challenge to the Yehuda, who says, if a king wants to do chalitza, he can. He's going to be spit upon. How could you allow that? And the answer is mitzvah shan. If it's for the sake of a mitzvah, that's different. If a king wants to forgo his honor to do a mitzvah, that's a nice thing. That actually brings itself as an honorable thing that the king is doing a mitzvah. It's only about foregoing his personal honor, like if a king decides he's going to carry his own suitcase. This is beneath the honor of a king to do that. So then we do not let him, we carry it for him. Ven Nosin, the next part of the Mishnah, we could look at inside, says that no one is allowed to marry the king's widow. Once the king dies, that's it. His wives, no one can ever marry. The Yehuda, however, disagrees and says that the next king, another king, is allowed to marry the king's widow. As we see regarding David, that he married the widow of Shaul, as the pasuk says, V'etana lecha et bet adonecha, the Navi says to the King David, I have given you the house of your master. V'etneshe adonecha bechekecha, and the woman of your master, which right now we understand to mean his wives. So the next king is allowed to marry the prior king's widows. Tanya, Amru lo Rabbi Yehuda, nashim hareuyot lo mebet hamelech, u'ma'ininu merav u'michal. So Braita explains this pasuk according to Chachamim, that they said to Rabbi Yehuda, no, King David didn't take the wives of King Shaul, but rather the women who are fit for him to marry from the king's family. And who is that? Merav and Michal, King Shaul's daughters. In fact, King Shaul promised his daughters to King David, Merav and Michal. We'll see the stories in a second. And then he ended up not giving his daughters to King David, but had them marry other people wrongly. So that's what it's talking about, that in the end, King David went and took his wives, those who he was supposed to marry. It's talking about the princesses, not Shaul's wives, but rather Shaul's daughters. Shalu talmidav et Rabbi Yosef, ha'ach nasa David sheteh achayot bechayehen. The students asked Rabbi Yosef, how was David allowed to marry two sisters in their lifetimes, Merav and Michal? That's against the Torah. You're not allowed to marry two sisters in their lifetime. times, if you're married to one sister and then she dies, then you can marry the other sister, but not while they're both alive. So we have two answers. Amar lehen Michal achar mitat Merav nisa'a. The first answer of Rabbi Yosef himself tells the students is that David married Michal only after Merav died. Merav was the older sister. He married her. She died. Then he's allowed to marry Michal. Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha omer kiddushe ta'ut hayu lo beMerav shenemar tina et ishti et Michal asher erasti li b'me'a orlot pelishtim. Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha says he was never actually married to Merav, although he tried to marry Merav. The kiddushin there was a mistake in the kiddushin that we'll see. And how do we know that? Because later on, King David says to Shaul's son Ishboshet, "Give me my wife Michal that I betrothed with 100 foreskins of Pelishtim." That was the deal that King Shaul made. Oh, you want to marry Michal? Bring me 100 foreskins of the Pelishtim, which he does. So he says, my wife Michal, meaning only Michal is his wife. Whatever happened with Merav, that he tried to do Kiddushin, but it didn't work. So he was never actually married to Merav, and that's why he was permitted to marry Michal. My Talmudah, how do you learn it from this pasuk? Amar Papa Michal ishti velo Merav ishti. Because it's a diuk. He says, Michal, my wife, meaning only Michal is my wife, Merav is not my wife. My Kiddushe Ta'ut, according to Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha, what's the story with this mistaken Kiddushin? What happened? The pasuk says that King Shaul said, whoever kills Goliath was threatening everybody. He says, whoever kills him, I will make that person rich and I will give him my daughter. Azal Katle. David, he was the small youngest, he went, unlikely candidate, and he killed Goliath with the slingshot. And so now he's deserving of riches and to marry King Shaul's daughter, Merav. Amar lo milveh it lach kabay v'mekadesh b'milveh ena mekudeshet. And so King Shaul played a trick on him. He says, okay, well, I owe you a lot of money, right? Okay, I owe you $1 million. And so you could use that for Kiddushin. Maybe David, he was young. He didn't have any money. And so he thought, okay, I'll do Kiddushin with the loan. Instead of paying me, that will be the Kiddushin. When you do Kiddushin with a minor, you can give the money directly to the father. However, the halacha actually is that if someone does Kiddushin with a loan, then the Kiddushin doesn't work. The groom has to actually give something to the bride, even if the bride owes him $1,000, and he says, you don't have to pay me. Canceling of a loan does not work for Kiddushin. And so King Shaul said, what'd you give me? You just canceled the loan instead of the Kiddushin? Oh, that's not a Kiddushin. And that's why the Kiddushin was beta'ut. And so King David was never married to Merav. And so Shaul says, I don't have to give him to you. And so Shaul went and gave his daughter Merav to a man named Adriel. As the pasuk says, when the time came, when Merav should have been given to King David, instead her father gave her to this man named Adriel. Amar le iba'et de'eten lach Michal zilaite li me'a orlot pelishtim. And then King Shaul says, well, now she's already married to Adriel, but he tells King David, if you want to marry my other daughter, Michal, then I'll let you. But first you have to bring me 100 foreskins from the Pelishtim. Azal aitile. So he did so. Amale milvel uperuta itlach kabay. So now, okay, you can do Kiddushin by giving me these orlot. What are all the orlot worth? What are you going to do with orla? It's worth less than a peruta. So now, they still have the money that I owe you. So now you're going to cancel the loan of the money that I owe you and give me a peruta. But the halacha is that if you try to do Kiddushin with canceling a loan and just a peruta, then it's not a valid Kiddushin. Shaul sevan milveh peruta datea milveh. Now, why is it no good? The Gemara elsewhere explains all this. And Shaul's following that opinion that says, if you try to do Kiddushin by canceling a loan and giving a peruta, we assume that the person has in mind the loan, right? That's the one that's more substantive. And so a person has in mind that they're going to get the kiddushin is going to work by canceling the loan, but it doesn't work by canceling the loan. Now, even though he gives her a peruta, but since their minds was on the loan, not on the peruta, so the peruta doesn't work, and canceling a loan doesn't work, and there's no kiddushin at all. So Shaul says, see, there's no kiddushin. David followed the other opinion there in that machloket that says when someone does kiddushin by canceling a loan and giving a peruta, then his mind is actually focused on the peruta, which is valid as long as you're giving a peruta, and that's what you have in mind you're going to use, and then the canceling of the loan as a side point. So from Shaul's point of view, there was no kiddushin, it was kiddushet ta'ut, even for Michal. And that's why Shaul then gives Michal to a different man named Palti. But King David thought that this is a valid kiddushin. That's one way to interpret it. Or another way to interpret what happened is that everybody agrees that if one does kiddushin by canceling a loan and giving a peruta, then his mind is actually on the peruta. So that would be fine. The problem is 100 orlot. What are they worth? Shaul says, and they're not worth anything. What are you going to do with that? You can't even use it for anything, and therefore it's actually worth less than a peruta. If you'd given something worth a peruta, fine, but 100 foreskins is not worth a peruta. And King David said, no, they're worth a peruta. What are you going to do with them? You could use them as food for dogs and cats. They would eat them, and therefore it was worth a peruta. So King David thought he was married to Michal, but Shaul thought he was not married to Michal. Okay, Rabbi Yosef, hi, tena et ishti et Michal, mai darishbeh. Now we go back and ask, according to Rabbi Yosef, he said that King David was really married to Merav, but then she died. And after she died, then he married Michal. According to that, how will we explain the pasuk when David says to Ishboshet, give me my wife, Michal? And before we understood that to mean that he's married to Michal only, and he was never married to Merav. So how's Rabbi Yosef going to explain that pasuk? Rabbi Yosef l'tameh detanya, Rabbi Yosef hayadoresh mikraot me'oravin. Rabbi Yosef follows his own opinion elsewhere, as it says, Rabbi Yosef would derive meaning from Pesukim that are mixed up. Sometimes you have Pesukim where there's a reference in one that actually refers to something else, and then that Pasuk actually refers to this one, and you have to take those words and interchange them, and then you can make meaning out of the seeming contradiction. Ketiv vayikach hamelech et shnei bnei rispa bat Aya asher yaledad Shaul et Armoni ve'et Mefiboshet ve'et chameshet bnei Michal asher yaledad le'Adriel hamecholati. It says at the end of Sefer Shemuel that the king took two sons of Rispa bat Aya that Shaul had with Armoni. That's not for us. And here's the main thing for us. And he also took Mephibosheth and the 5 sons of Michal that she gave birth to, married to Adriel. So this is strange because Michal was not married to Adriel. Merav was married to Adriel. V'chil Adriel netana. Did Shaul give Michal to Adriel? No. V'alo lePalti ben Laish netana. Shaul gave Michal to a man named Palti ben Laish. So this pasuk here in Shemuel Bet 21 seems to be matching Michal to the wrong husband, to Adriel instead of to Palti. Tichti v'Shaul natan et Michal beto eshet David Palti ben Laish. As pasuk says, Shaul gave Michal to Michal, his daughter, the wife of David. She really was rightfully the wife of David, but Shaul wrongly gave her to Palti, not to Adriel. So how can you make sense of this pasuk? Ela makish kiddushe merav laAdriel v'kiddushe Michal lePalti. Ma kiddushe Michal lePalti ba'avera, av kiddushe merav laAdriel ba'avera. Rather, it's switching the names in order to make a comparison, and it compares the kiddushin of Merav to Adriel to the kiddushin of Michal to Palti, just like the kiddushin of Michal to Palti was in sin. Michal was legitimately married to David, and therefore, when the Shaul gave her to Palti, she was living in sin with Palti. Eventually, King David says, "Give me my wife," and they take Michal away from Palti. Sad scene of Palti walking after his wife that really wasn't his wife the whole time, and they tell him, "Okay, go home. It's not your wife. So just like that was in sin, so too the kiddushin of Merav to Adriel was in sin, because really she was betrothed to David, and therefore was not allowed to be, Merav was not allowed to be with Adriel. And that's why it switches the names to compare the two marriages, that really King David was legitimately married to both of them, and these other men that King Shaul gave them to, they were living with them only in sin. Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha nameh, haketi bet chameshet bnei Michal bat Shaul. And now we'll ask the same question to Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha. He didn't say that Merav died, but rather that the kiddushin with Merav was kiddushe ta'ut, and so King David actually was never married to Merav. According to him, why does the pasuk say that the 5 sons that Michal had with Adriel, Michal was never married to, or lived with, and was not with Adriel at all, but rather Palti. So Rabbi Yoshua says, do you think Michal gave birth to these sons? No, Merav actually did give birth to the sons. Merav was married to Adriel and actually had these sons. Merav yalda u'Michal gidela. But even though Merav bore them, Michal brought them up. Leficha nikreu al shema, and therefore they're called her sons. Le'lamedcha shekol hamegadel yatom betoch beto ma'aleh alav hakatub ki'ilu yelado. This teaches that anyone who brings up orphans in his home, if someone takes in orphans, they have no parents, and you adopt them and bring them up in your home, the pasuk considers it as if you have given birth to them. And that's why Michal, who brought up these kids, it calls them the children of Michal. Really, they were the children of Merav with Adriel, and that's why it still says that Adriel was the father, but because Michal is the one that brought them up, so it's actually a very nice pasuk that is a good source for adoption or whatever, fostering or whatever, taking care of children that are not biologically yours. We still consider the parents who brought up a child to be the parents, because the pasuk here literally calls Michal the parents of the mother of these children, even though she was not the biological mother. This lesson, that if you bring up other people's kids and it's as if you gave birth to them, we learn from some other sources as well. A mnemonic for the following teachings is Chanina Kara, Yochanan Vishto Elazar Gula Shmuel Beli Mudai Siman. The first one is Chanina. Rabbi Chanina Omer Me'acha Vatikrena Lo Shechenot Shem Lemor Yulad Ben LaNaomi V'chi Naomi Yalda V'halo Rut Yalda Ela Rut Yalda V'Naomi Gidela Lefichach Nikra Al Shemaha. Rabbi Chanina says we can learn this lesson from here, that when Ruth had a son, the neighbors gave him a name, saying a son was born to Naomi. Now, did Naomi give birth to the son? No, Ruth did. Rather, although Ruth gave birth to this child, Naomi is the one who raised him, and therefore the child was called the son of Naomi. So we learn from here, whoever raises a child is called their parent. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Mehacha Vishto HaYehudiya Yalda Et Yered Avi Gedor Vegomer Vele Bene Bitya Bat Paro Asher Lakach Lo Mared. A pasuk in Divrei Amim talks about Kalev, and his wife was Yehudiya. You could interpret this as just his Jewish wife, but here it's interpreting it as his name, and he had a number of children. And then the rest of the pasuk says these are the children of Bitya, the daughter of Paro. Elsewhere the Gemara says these names, Yered, Avi, Gedor, are all nicknames for Moshe, the daughter of Bitya, who actually adopted him. And Bitya was married to Mared. Now, the Rasha says, Mered ze Kalev. Lama nikra shemo Mered shemarad ba'asat meraglim. Mered is actually a nickname for Kalev ben Yefuneh. Why was he called Mered, rebellion? Because he rebelled against the counsel of the other bad spies. V'chi Bitya yaleda v'lo Yochebed yaleda. So now these names who are that are references to Moshe, is it true that Batya gave birth to Moshe? Yocheved gave birth to Moshe. So why does it say that Batya did? Ela Yocheved yada uBitya gidela lefichach nikra al shema. Even though Yocheved was the biological mother, Then she put him on the river, and Bitya saved him and brought him up. And therefore, Moshe is called the son of Bitya. Rabbi Elazar Amar Mehacha, Ga'alta Bizro Amecha B'nei Yaakov Yosef Sela, V'chi Yosef Yalad, V'halo Yaakov Yalad, Ela Yaakov Yalad, V'Yosef Kilkel, Lefichach Nikreu Al Shema. Another source from a pasuk in Tehillim that says, "You Hashem, with your arm have redeemed your people, the children of Yaakov and Yosef." Now, did Yosef have Bnei Yaakov? Yaakov did, right? Bnei Yaakov, the tribes were saved, and from Egypt were the sons of Yaakov, and not the sons of Yosef. But rather, even though Yaakov was the biological father, Yosef sustained them, took care of them, and therefore he brought them up, and so they're called, as you can call even all of Bnei Israel, the sons of Yosef. Amar Rabbi Shemuel bar Nachmani Amar Rabbi Yonatan, Kol melamed ben chaverot Torah ma'aleh alav hakatuv ki'ilu yelado. So far we saw that if someone brings up someone else's child, he's called a parent. And now we learn from Rabbi Yonatan that anyone who teaches someone else's child Torah, it's as if he brought him up. Shneimar ve'ele toledot Aharon Moshe ketib ve'ele shemot bnei Aharon lomar lecha Aharon yalad Moshe limed lefich nikreu al shemo. One pasuk says these are the generations of Aharon and Moshe, and you'd expect it to say the names of the children of Aharon and Moshe, but the next pasuk just says these are names of Aharon. So it doesn't not the names of Moshe's children. It lists Aharon's children, not Moshe's children. So why does it say these are the generations of Moshe, and then it lists Aharon's children to teach you that although Aharon gave birth to them, Moshe taught them, and therefore the children of Aharon are also called the children of Moshe. Lachen ko amar Hashem el bet Yaakov asher pada et Abraham. Another derasha about child rearing, a question on this pasuk in Yeshaya. It says, therefore Hashem says to Bet Yaakov, who redeemed Abraham. Where do we ever see that Yaakov redeemed Abraham? Amar Rav Yehuda shepetao misar gidule banim. Yaakov saved Abraham from the suffering of raising children. Yaakov had 12 sons. He gave birth to all the tribes of Israel. And Abraham didn't have to do that. Abraham pushed it down the line a couple of generations. So Abraham, he had his own problems raising his children, but now imagine if it was 12. And so Yaakov redeemed Abraham from the trouble of raising so many children. V'hainu dichtib lo ata yebosh Yaakov v'gomer lo ata ebosh Yaakov me'aviv v'lo ata panav yechevaru me'avi aviv. And this explains the pasuk that Yaakov now will not be ashamed, neither shall his face wax pale. We interpret each half of the pasuk, the beginning, that he will not be ashamed. That's before his father Yitzchak, and his face will not be pale. That's from his father's father, from Abraham, because they will be grateful to him that he brought up all his children within the Berit and had to deal with all of the difficulties that involved. Keti palti uchti paltiel. Now back to Michal, who was technically married to David, but then Shaul gave her to Palti. One pasuk calls him Palti, and the other pasuk calls him Paltiel. So which one was it? Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Palti Shemo, v'lama nekira Shemo Paltiel, shepelato el mina avera. Really his name was Palti. So why was he called Paltiel? Because Hashem saved him from sin. You see, even though Shaul said, okay, Palti, you take my daughter Michal. So he had to. But Palti knew that Michal's really married to David, and therefore she's Eshet Ish, off limits. And so he was not allowed to sleep with her. And Hashem helped him and saved him from sin. Me'asa na'as chereb beno lebena. Amar kol ha'asek bedavar zeh yidaker bechereb zeh. So what did he do to get saved from sin? He put a sword in the bed between himself and her. And he says, anyone who engages in this matter, meaning in relations with her, shall be stead by a sword. And that was a reminder to him always that she is off limits. He's not allowed to be with her. Now it says afterwards, when King David said, now bring me my wife, and they went and they took Michal from Palti, and Palti, it says Palti, her husband, went with her, weeping as he went, following her all the way to Bachurim, until David's men said, okay, that's enough, right? Go back. She's not married to you, so go back home. So how come it calls Palti her husband? And the answer is Shenasa la Kisha, even though technically they were not married, he was like a husband to her. He loved her and gave her care, and took care of her, sustained her like a husband would, even though he knew they were not actually married. And it says he was walking and crying. Why was he crying if he knew he was married to her the whole time? Because he no longer had the opportunity to do the mitzvah of refraining himself from sleeping with her. That was very difficult for him to do, but he got merit from the reward of that mitzvah. And now that she's gone, he won't have that mitzvah anymore, that challenge. Ad bachurim shenasu shenhem kebachurim shelo tamu ta'am bi'ah. And it says they went until a place called Bachurim, but this midrash reads it allegorically that both of them were like young people, that they did not taste a sin at all. They never had bi'ah with each other all those years that they were together. Amar Rabbi Yochanan tokpo shel Yosef an vatnuto shel Boaz. Rabbi Yochanan says the great strength of Yosef, he refrained himself from sinning with Eshet Potifar, was a modest thing for Boaz, meaning what Boaz did, not sinning with Ruth, was even greater. Tokpo shel Boaz, and the great strength of Boaz, who refrained from being with Ruth until they were properly married, an vatnuto shel Palti ben Laish, was a modest thing for Palti ben Laish. In other words, Palti, refraining himself from Michal, was an even much greater test. Tokpo shel Yosef an vatnuto shel Boaz dichti vahi b'chasi alayla ve'echerad ha'ish va'yilafet. Now we'll describe each of these cases. The greatness of Yosef, which was great, that he stopped himself from sinning with Eshet Potifar, who was she was married, so that's Eshet Ish, was a modest thing for Boaz. Regarding Boaz, it says in the middle of the night, he saw that there was a woman at his feet, and says Va'yilafet, and he turned himself. What does that mean? Mai Va'yilafet amarav shenasa besaro kerashe lefatot. It means that his flesh, his male member, became like the head of a turnip. He was aroused, but even so, he did not have relations with Ruth. Now, this was a more difficult test because Ruth actually was single, so he would not have been violating any sin by being with Ruth, whereas Yosef was Eshet Ish. And so for Yosef to refrain from the Eshet Potifar, that is a great test, but Boaz could have easily justified, and also she was lying down right next to him, and so he could have easily justified being with her, but he said, no, we're going to go do it in the right procedure and get married and all that, and so his test was greater. Tokpo shel Boaz an vatnuto shel Palti ben Laish ke de Amaran, and the strength of Boaz, who did refrain himself, but that was only for one night, and then he went and he was able to marry her. So that is not so hard to be able to refrain oneself from being with this woman, and then knowing that, okay, he's going to have to go through the procedure, and there's another guy that maybe he'll take her, but eventually he marries her. Whereas Palti ben Laish, his test was every night for many, many years, and knowing that he's never going to be able to sleep with her, and yet he was able to overcome, and so his test was greater than that of the others. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, ma dichtiv rabot panot asuchai vat alit al kulana, rabot panot asuchai al ze Yosef uBoaz, at alit al kulana ze Palti ben Laish. Rabbi Yochanan says, what is the pasuk that says, many daughters have done valiantly, but you excel above them all? This rabot panot asuchai, the greatness of most people, is Yosef and Boaz. They they did an excellent job to a certain level. But you are greater than everybody. Who's the you are greater than everybody? That's Palti ben Laish, whose piety exceeded even that of Yosef and Boaz. Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman, Amar Rabbi Yonatan, Ma dichtiv sheker achen vehebel hayofi, sheker achen ze Yosef, hebel hayofi ze Boaz, yirat Hashem hititalal ze Palti ben Laish. Similar derivation from the next pasuk in Mishle from Eshet Chayil that says grace is deceitful. That refers to Yosef, right? He didn't give in to grace. And beauty is vain. This refers to Boaz. He said, I'm not going to give in to just beauty. Whereas the fear of Hashem, that person shall be praised. That refers to Palti ben Laish. Because of his fear of heaven, he did not sin at all with Michal. Or another interpretation of this pasuk is comparing generations. The Sheker Achen is the lowest level. That was a generation of Moshe. Moshe's generation was indeed very great. And even greater than that was the generation of Bnei Yisrael in the time of Yehoshua. But even greater than both of them was at the time of Chizkiah, where it says everybody was studying Torah, even though there was war and it was difficult, still everybody was studying Torah. So that generation was greater than the ones before. Berebi Eli, or another derasha takes it yet a step further and says Sheker Achen. That's referring to the generations of Moshe and Aharon. Hebel Hayofi, the second level, is talking about Chizkiah, as we said here. And Yirat Hashem hititalal, the fear of Hashem, that shall be praised. That's talking about an even greater level of the generation of Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Rabbi Eli. What happened then? Amru alav al Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eli shehayu shisha talmidim mitkasim. In his generation, people were very poor, and 6 students would have to cover themselves with one garment. That's how poor they were. They had just had one blanket to cover 6 students, and yet they still studied Torah. They didn't say we're too poor, we're impoverished, we can't study Torah, and that's how great their devotion was, which shows that they were greater than even those generations before them. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen ve'amen.